The mist came up off the Imjin like breath off a dying animal, and Captain Peter Ormrod could not see 50 yards in front of his Centurion. It was the morning of April the 25th, 1951. Somewhere ahead, up a track that narrowed to a goat path between paddy walls and shale, the men of the Gloucestershire Regiment were dying on a hill they would never give a proper name to, just a number, 235, that would pass into the bleak liturgy of the British Army as Gloucester Hill. Ormrod's orders were simple and very nearly suicidal. Take your tanks up the valley. Bring the infantry out. Do not, under any circumstances, stop. He buttoned down. The 50-ton hull shuddered forward into the murk, and the war closed around it. What happened over the next several hours would become one of the strangest and most studied episodes of the entire Korean War. Not because of the ground gained, for almost none was, but because of what the enemy made of it afterwards. Chinese and North Korean officers, picking over the wreckage of their own offensive, would write reports back up the chain that read less like military assessment and more like superstition. They had thrown human waves against a British brigade and broken it, yes. But the tanks they could not account for. The shells bounced. The things kept coming. One captured document, translated by intelligence officers and passed quietly up to the staff in Tokyo and thence to the War Office in London, contained a phrase that stuck. The British steel monsters, it said in effect, could not be stopped. Now, you should be skeptical of any war story that arrives wrapped in a tidy quotation, and we shall come to exactly how much we can trust this one. War produces myths, the way damp produces mould, and the British are not above polishing their own legends until they gleam. But strip away the romance, and a hard kernel remains, attested in the diaries, the after-action reports, and the dry official histories held at Kew. The Centurion tank, sent to Korea almost as an afterthought, performed in those mountains so far beyond what anyone in Whitehall had dared hope that it changed the trajectory of post-war British armoured doctrine, rescued a national reputation that had taken a battering since 1945, and quietly became the most successful tank Britain ever built. This is the story of how a vehicle designed to fight in the hedgerows of Normandy, a tank that arrived in Europe too late to fire a shot in anger against the Germans, found its proving ground instead in the frozen ridgelines above the 38th parallel against an enemy nobody in 1944 had imagined. It is a story about engineering and about the men who took a half-finished idea and turned it into the backbone of the British Army for a generation. It is a story about a brigade abandoned to its fate and the tank crews who refused to abandon it in turn. And it is, in the end, a story about Britain itself. A power in decline, its empire fraying, its treasury empty, discovering that it could still build the finest fighting machine in the world and still send its young men to do impossible things with it on the far side of the earth. But to understand why a British tank ended up in a Korean valley at all, we have to go back. Back past the Imjin, past the cold winter of 1950, back to a Britain exhausted by one war and stumbling, almost by accident, into the long shadow of the next. Because the road to Gloucester Hill did not begin in Korea at all, it began in a bankrupt, rationed, victorious nation that had quite forgotten how to feel like a winner. In the summer of 1950, Britain was a strange contradiction. On paper, she was a victor, one of the big three, a permanent member of the new Security Council, ruler still of an empire on which the sun had not entirely set. In practice, she was broke. The war had cost her a quarter of her national wealth. The Americans had switched off Lend-Lease the moment Japan surrendered, with a brusqueness that Whitehall never quite forgave. Clement Attlee's Labour government was building the welfare state on borrowed money and a punishing American loan negotiated by Maynard Keynes in the last great effort of his life. Bread was rationed. Bread, which had not been rationed during the war itself. The winter of 1947 had nearly frozen the country to a standstill. India had gone in 1947, Palestine in 1948. The empire was not so much being dismantled as quietly slipping through tired fingers. And yet, Britain still thought of herself as a great power and behaved like one. Ernest Bevin, the formidable working-class Foreign Secretary, was determined that she should remain at the top table. He had been instrumental in the creation of NATO in 1949. He understood, perhaps better than anyone in the cabinet, that the future of British security lay in binding the Americans to the defence of Europe. And that meant proving, again and again, that Britain was a partner worth having. When the test came, Britain would have to show up. The test came on June 25, 1950, when the North Korean People's Army poured across the 38th parallel into the south. Stalin had given his blessing. Kim Il-sung's tanks, Soviet-built T-34s, the same model that had ground the Wehrmacht into the dust, rolled almost unopposed towards Seoul. The Americans, caught flat-footed, scrambled what forces they had from occupation duty in Japan and were very nearly thrown into the sea at Pusan. In London, the reaction was swift and, for a near-bankrupt nation, remarkable. The Attlee government committed forces almost at once. There was strategic calculation in it. Bevin and the chiefs of staff saw that the price of American goodwill, and of the special relationship itself, was British blood on the line beside American blood. There was principle in it too. The United Nations had been invoked. Collective security was being tested in its infancy, and Britain had spent the 1930s learning what happened when aggression went unanswered. Appeasement was a word that still burned, so the order went out. The 27th Infantry Brigade would deploy from Hong Kong. The 29th Independent Infantry Brigade Group would form in England and sail east. And with the 29th would go something that nobody had yet tested in battle. A squadron of the newest tank in the British infantry, a brooding 50-ton machine called the Centurion. The army that sent it was not the confident force of 1945. It was stretched across a contracting empire. Malaya, where a communist insurgency was already underway. Germany, where the British Army of the Rhine watched the Soviet divisions across the inner border. The Canal Zone in Egypt. Trouble brewing everywhere. National service kept the ranks filled with conscripts, 18-year-olds who had expected to do their 2 years square bashing in Catterick and found themselves instead on a troopship bound for a country most of them could not have placed on a map. The chiefs of staff harboured private doubts about Korea. Field Marshal Slim, the great commander of the Burma campaign, now chief of the Imperial General Staff, worried about a sideshow draining resources from the defence of Europe, which he and most of Whitehall regarded as the only theatre that truly mattered. But the decision was made. The brigades sailed. And among the crated stores and the lorries and the guns went the Centurions, untried, unproven, and about to be thrown into precisely the kind of terrain they had never been designed to fight in. To understand the Centurion, you have to understand the humiliation that produced it. For most of the Second World War, British tank design had been, to put it bluntly, a national embarrassment. British crews in the Western Desert had gone into battle in Crusaders and Covenanters that broke down with dispiriting regularity, undergunned and under-armoured, only to be picked off at long range by German panzers and the dreaded 88mm anti-tank gun. The men called some of their own tanks coffins. The problem was that Britain had spent the interwar years splitting the difference, building fast, lightly armoured cruiser tanks for the cavalry role and slow, heavy infantry tanks for the plodding work, and excelling at neither. Time and again, British armour was outclassed by German engineering. By 1943, with the lessons of North Africa written in blood, the Department of Tank Design was given a new and uncompromising brief: build a single tank that could do everything. It needed a dual-purpose gun that could fire both high explosive at infantry and armor-piercing shot at enemy tanks. It needed armor thick enough to shrug off the 88. It needed reliability, the one quality British tanks had most conspicuously lacked. The result was designated A41, and it drew on every hard lesson of the desert and Normandy. The first prototypes were rushed to Belgium in May 1945 and arrived just days after the German surrender. The war in Europe was over. The new tank had missed it entirely. But the engineers had got something profoundly right. The Centurion, as it was named, was built around the magnificent Rolls-Royce Meteor engine, a detuned version of the Merlin that had powered the Spitfire and the Lancaster. It had a torsion bar suspension that gave it a remarkably stable ride across broken ground. And in its mature form, it carried the Royal Ordnance 20-pounder gun, an 84mm weapon of devastating accuracy. That gun could punch through 330mm of steel plate at 100 yards, more than twice what the feared German 88 had managed. Crucially, the Centurion's gun was stabilized, allowing it to fire accurately on the move and over rough terrain, a capability that gave British crews an enormous edge. Into this machine climbed the men of the 8th King's Royal Irish Hussars, a cavalry regiment with a lineage stretching back to the 18th century. C Squadron's Centurions, Mark III's, the best variant then available, were diverted from a shipment originally bound for Australia and handed to the Hussars at short notice. The regiment trained hard through the autumn of 1950 and shipped out, joining the 29th Brigade in a career that was, by the time they arrived at Busan, plunging into catastrophe. For the war had turned again. General MacArthur's brilliant landing at Incheon in September 1950 had thrown the North Koreans into headlong retreat, and UN forces had driven north towards the Yalu and the Chinese frontier, scenting total victory. Then, in late November, the trap sprang. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese People's Volunteers crossed the river and fell upon the overextended UN columns. What followed was the longest retreat in American military history, the Great Bug Out, as the soldiers grimly called it. The Hussars, who had unloaded their tanks expecting a victory parade towards Pyongyang, instead found themselves part of a fighting withdrawal in temperatures that dropped to 30 degrees below freezing, oil congealing, breech blocks seizing, men losing fingers to the cold. Through that bitter winter, the British dug in along the line of the Imjin River, north of Seoul, and waited. The intelligence picture was murky but ominous. Everyone knew the Chinese were massing. Everyone knew an offensive was coming. The only questions were where and when, and whether a thinly held line of British infantry with a single squadron of untested tanks in support could hold it when it broke. The blow fell on the night of April 22nd, 1951. It was part of what the Chinese called their fifth phase campaign, and the rest of the world came to know as the Spring Offensive. A colossal effort to shatter the UN line, retake Seoul, and force a victory before the front could solidify. The Chinese commander, Peng Dehuai, threw the better part of 3 field armies into the assault. On the lower Imjin, the weight fell squarely upon the 29th Independent Infantry Brigade Group, the Gloucestershire Regiment, the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, the Royal Ulster Rifles, a Belgian battalion, and the Centurions of the 8th Hussars in support. Against them came the entire Chinese 63rd Army, perhaps 27,000 men against a brigade of fewer than 4,000. The arithmetic was grotesque, and the Chinese method made it more so. Short of trained troops, Peng used his rawest formations as a battering ram, sending wave after wave forward to absorb the defenders' fire and exhaust their ammunition, then following with his best soldiers through the gaps. The British called it the human wave, and the men who faced it never forgot the sound of the bugles and whistles that signalled each fresh assault, nor the eerie sight of the hillsides moving in the dark. The Glosters, holding the brigade's left, were quickly cut off. Lieutenant Colonel Fred Kahn pulled his battalion back onto Hill 235, a barren feature that dominated the valley, and there they made their stand. By the second night, they were entirely surrounded. Their wireless reports, calm and understated in the way of the British infantry, told an increasingly desperate story. Ammunition was running low. The Chinese were among the forward trenches. At one point, Kahn's men called down artillery onto their own positions. And here the tanks come into the story properly. The terrain was every armoured officer's nightmare. Narrow valley tracks, paddy fields, ridge lines too steep for a tank to climb, ground that funneled the Centurions into killing zones where infantry with explosive charges and pole mines could get in close. The official doctrine said this was not tank country. The Hussars were about to prove the doctrine wrong. On the morning of April the 23rd, the Centurions began to move up the valley, firing in direct support of the infantry, evacuating the wounded, blasting Chinese troops off the high ground with high explosive and machine gun fire at point-blank range. A captured Chinese soldier later remarked, with what one imagines was real feeling, that the tanks had hunted them across slopes they had thought impossible to armour. But it was on the 25th, the day of the breakout, that the legend was forged. With the brigade ordered to withdraw and the Glosters effectively beyond reach, a scratch relief column was assembled to try to fight up the valley. Centurions of the Hussars, Filipino infantry, American light tanks, and the odds and ends of the brigade echelon, the ragtag and bobtail, as one officer cheerfully put it. The column ground forward into a gauntlet of fire. What none of them yet knew was that the valley itself had become a trap, that the Glosters could not be reached in time, and that the long retreat south would test the Centurions and their crews to the absolute limit of what tank and man could endure. The hardest fighting of the entire battle was still ahead, and it would be the tanks, not the infantry, who had to fight their way out last. The withdrawal of the 29th Brigade down the Imjin Valley on April the 25th, 1951, was one of those actions that should not, by any sober calculation, have succeeded at all. The rearguard fell to the 8th Hussars, and command of the tank action to Major Henry Huth, the squadron leader, a calm, exact officer who would emerge from the day with a distinguished service order and a reputation that lasted the rest of his life. The Centurions had to cover the infantry's retreat down a single valley road while Chinese troops swarmed the heights on both sides, pouring fire down onto the column and rushing the tanks with satchel charges and improvised mines. The mist of the early morning had given way to clear light, and the enemy was everywhere. Picture it from inside the turret. The noise first, the flat crack of the 20-pounder, the hammer of the coaxial baser, the ring and spang of small arms, rounds, and shrapnel off the armour like hail on a tin roof. Spent cases clattering on the turret floor. The reek of cordite and hot oil and diesel. Chinese infantry appearing out of the scrub at 10 yards, close enough to climb onto the hull, so that crews took to traversing their turrets violently to throw them off, and firing their machine guns along the decks of the tanks beside them to sweep the attackers clear. Some Chinese clambered aboard and tried to prise open hatches. The tankmen fought them off with revolvers and bare hands, and the following tanks shot them off their comrades' backs. The Centurions ground south through this storm, mile after mile, the column moving at the pace of the slowest vehicle and the rearmost tank, always the most exposed. Tanks bogged in the paddy. Tanks shed tracks under the strain and had to be abandoned and destroyed. A handful were lost. But the squadron kept moving and kept the road open and brought the bulk of the brigade out of the trap. It was, by any measure, a feat of cold nerve and brutal driving. 50 tons of British steel bludgeoning its way through an encircling army. The last act belonged to Major Huth. Tradition in the regiment holds that the final shell fired in the battle was his. The last defiant round from the rearmost Centurion as the squadron at last cleared the worst of the gauntlet. Behind them, on Hill 235, the guns had fallen silent. Colonel Khan and 459 of his Glosters were taken prisoner. The battalion had lost some 620 men, killed, wounded, or captured. Only a handful, led out by Major Mike Harvey on a desperate cross-country dash, ever reached friendly lines. But the brigade had not been destroyed. The line had bent, and very nearly broken, yet Pong's great offensive had been blunted here and at Kapyong, where Australian and Canadian troops held firm. The road to Seoul stayed shut. The Chinese had paid a staggering price, perhaps 10,000 casualties for the 29th Brigade sector alone. And the tanks had done the impossible. The American divisional commander, Major General John Iron Mike O'Daniel, paid them a tribute that British armoured officers would quote with quiet pride for decades. In their Centurions, he said, the 8th Hussars had evolved a new type of tank warfare. They had taught the Americans that anywhere a tank can go is tank country, even the tops of mountains. That sentence is the real meaning of the title of this film. Strip away the apocryphal "nothing stops them," and what remains is sturdier and more telling. Even the enemy, even Britain's own allies, came away from the Imjin convinced that this British machine could go and do what no tank was supposed to manage. The legend grew in the telling. But the legend had a hard, true core, hammered out in that valley over 3 days in April. Victory, if that is even the word for what happened on the Imjin, was paid for dearly, and the bill came due in several currencies at once. The human cost was the heaviest. The 29th Brigade lost over 1,000 men in the battle, the Glosters bearing the worst of it. Lieutenant Colonel Khan went into a Chinese prison camp, where he would spend much of his captivity in solitary confinement, and where, with extraordinary quiet dignity, he carved a small stone cross that is kept to this day in Gloucester Cathedral. He was awarded the Victoria Cross on his release in 1953. Lieutenant Philip Curtis of the Glosters received a posthumous VC for a hopeless one-man charge against a Chinese machine gun position. These were not abstractions. These were Gloucestershire men, many of them national servicemen and recalled reservists, lost on a hill they had never heard of for a country they had never seen. For the 8th Hussars, the cost was measured in machines as much as men, though the crews too took losses. Several Centurions had to be abandoned and demolished to deny them to the enemy. A bitter business for a tank crew blowing up their own mount. There was a hard institutional lesson in it. The recovery of damaged armour under fire was something the British had not properly planned for. And the experience drove improvements in armoured recovery that bore fruit later in the war. There was a political cost too, and a political reckoning. The near destruction of a British battalion raised uncomfortable questions in London. Had the brigade been hung out to dry by inadequate American command arrangements? Had its withdrawal been authorized too late? The episode fed a persistent strain of British unease about serving under American operational control, a tension that ran right through the alliance and would surface again, more bitterly, over Suez 5 years later. Whitehall and the Chiefs of Staff studied the battle closely. The Joint Intelligence Committee and the War Office pored over the captured enemy documents and the interrogation reports, hunting for what the Chinese method revealed and how British forces should adapt to it. And yet, woven through the cost, there was something Britain badly needed in 1951, a story of which to be proud. The stand of the Glosters caught the imagination of the world. Here, the press could say, was the old British infantry virtue undimmed, the thin line holding against impossible odds, the calm voice on the wireless, the cross carved in a prison cell. For a nation worn down by austerity and the loss of empire, the Imjin offered a flash of the old fire. It mattered, in a way that ledgers cannot capture, that British soldiers had done something magnificent and that the Americans had noticed. The intelligence harvest mattered more concretely. British and American staffs now understood the rhythm of the Chinese offensive, the massing, the bugles, the human wave, the follow-through, and learned to break it with coordinated artillery and armour. The Centurion's performance reshaped thinking at the most practical level. Here was proof that a heavy, well-armoured, accurately gunned tank, properly handled, could dominate ground the textbooks had written off. The lesson fed directly into how the British would fight the static second half of the war, when armour became, in effect, mobile artillery dug into the ridgelines. What Britain learned on the Imjin, in short, was twofold. She learned, painfully, the limits of her independence within the alliance, that she would fight America's wars and sometimes pay America's prices. And she learned, more happily, that her engineers had built something extraordinary, and that the Centurion was a weapon around which a battered post-war army could rebuild its confidence and its doctrine. Both lessons would echo through the rest of the Cold War. The war did not end at the Imjin, it curdled. After the failure of the spring offensive and the UN counterstrokes that followed, the front congealed roughly along the 38th parallel, and the conflict settled into something that the older soldiers found horribly familiar: a war of trenches, wire, patrols, and bombardment that looked uncannily like the Western Front of 1916. The peace talks at Panmunjom dragged on for 2 years, while men went on dying for hills and outposts whose only value was as bargaining chips. The 1st Commonwealth Division, formed in 1951 to bring the British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, and Indian medical contributions under one command, held its sector of the line with grim professionalism. And the Centurions, having proved they could fight a war of movement in the mountains, now had to learn a different trade entirely. In the static phase, they became, in the brutally honest phrase of one Royal Tank Regiment officer, very expensive static steel pillboxes, dug in hull down on the ridgelines, their stabilized 20-pounders used as pinpoint artillery to smash Chinese bunkers and break up the night assaults. Successive regiments rotated through: the 5th Royal Inniskilling Dragoon Guards, then the 1st Royal Tank Regiment from December 1952, then the 5th RTR. The climax of this phase came at a crescent-shaped ridge near the Salmon River that the soldiers called the Hook. It was fought over no fewer than 4 times, because whoever held it controlled the approach to Seoul. The bloodiest defence came on the night of May 28, 1953, barely 2 months before the armistice, when the Chinese flung a massive assault against the 1st Battalion, the Duke of Wellington's regiment. The Centurions of C Squadron, 1st RTR, dug in along the front, fired directly into the attacking waves. In a single night's action, they poured 504 rounds of high explosive and some 22,500 machine gun rounds into the enemy. The Dukes held. Chinese casualties were counted in the hundreds and estimated in the thousands. The defenders lost 24 killed. The hook had held, and the Centurion had been the spine of the defence. When the guns finally fell silent on July 27, 1953, the Centurion emerged from the Korean War with a reputation that transformed its fortunes. The tank that had missed the Second World War had become, by common consent on both sides of the Atlantic, one of the finest fighting vehicles in the world. American officers who had watched it work were impressed. So, more to the point, were Britain's own treasury and her arms export salesmen. The consequences rippled outward through the Cold War. The Centurion became the backbone of the British Army of the Rhine, the armoured fist that NATO planned to throw against any Soviet thrust through the North German plain. The place Slim and the Chiefs of Staff had always insisted was the theatre that truly mattered. It was sold across the world, to Australia, which took it to Vietnam, to India and to Pakistan, who turned it on one another, and most famously to Israel, where it was rebuilt, upgunned, and immortalized in the great tank battles of the Sinai and the Golan Heights in 1967 and 1973. A British tank, blooded in a Korean valley, would help decide the fate of the Middle East. For Britain herself, Korea confirmed the pattern of the early Cold War. She had shown up. She had bled beside the Americans and earned, for a time, a louder voice in Washington. The special relationship held, though its limits would be brutally exposed at Suez in 1956, when the Americans pulled the financial rug from under an independent British adventure and taught Whitehall, once and for all, the price of going it alone. The Centurion endured longer than the certainties of the world that built it. So, what are we to make of it all? The tank, the legend, the line of British steel grinding up an impossible valley with the wounded lashed to its hull. Start with the machine itself, because its record is almost without parallel. The Centurion fought in a dozen wars across 4 decades, from the Korean ridgelines to the Suez Canal, from the jungles of Vietnam to the dust of the Sinai and the Golan. It outlived the empire that built it. Variants of the chassis soldiered on into the 21st century. No other British tank, arguably no other Western tank of its generation, comes close to that span of service. It was the vindication of every hard lesson learned in the disasters of the desert, the moment British tank design stopped being a national joke and became a national export. That redemption is worth pausing on, because the British do not always get engineering right, and when they do, it is worth saying so plainly. But the deeper legacy is about Britain herself, and her place in the world she was learning to inhabit. Korea was the first hot war of the Cold War, and Britain fought it, not as the senior partner she had been in 1940, but as the junior one she was becoming. She went because Bevan and the chiefs understood that influence had to be earned in blood, that the Atlantic Alliance was the spine of British security, and that a nation which would not fight for collective security forfeited the right to shape it. The Glosters on Hill 235 and the Hussars in the valley below were, in a real sense, instruments of British grand strategy, proof of reliability, paid in young lives, in a currency Washington understood. And what of the title, those North Korean and Chinese officers, and the steel monsters that could not be stopped? Be skeptical, as you should always be, of war's tidy quotations. The single sentence is hard to pin to a single document, and legends have a way of improving with each retelling. But the substance is genuine, and it is attested in places harder to argue with than memory. In the after-action reports, in the captured papers studied at the War Office, in the awe of an American general who watched British tanks climb mountains he had thought impassable. The enemy who faced the Centurion on the Imjin came away believing they had met something they could not break. They were, very nearly, right. There is a lesson in that for our own age when Britain again debates her weight in the world. Her armies smaller than at any time in living memory, her place in great events less certain. The Centurion story is a reminder that a nation in relative decline can still build the best of something, can still send its people to do hard things well, can still matter out of all proportion to its size, if it chooses to. Whether that is comfort or warning, I leave to you. Because I should very much like to know what you think. Was Britain right to commit her exhausted, rationed, war-weary nation to a war on the far side of the world in 1950? Was the Centurion truly the finest tank of its age, or does that crown belong elsewhere? And do you believe those enemy reports, or is "nothing stops them" just another varnished battlefield legend? Tell me in the comments. I read them, and the arguments down there are very often better than the script. If this film held you, do consider liking it and subscribing, because there is a great deal more of this history to come, and I would be glad of your company for it. Until next time.